On our last episode, Halmela told the raven the harrowing tale of her mother's journey to the Foul Grove, and of her miraculous yet mysterious rescue. She also told the raven of the great storm that created the graveyard of trees. Upon hearing these foul tales, the raven concluded the dark force was at hand, perhaps the very one he sought. There was a rather long and heavy silence in the moments after the conclusion to Halmela's tale. The chipmunk stared up at the sky, her thoughts seemingly a million miles away. The raven was also deep in thought, the wheels and cogs in his brain spinning furiously. Halmela had certainly been extremely helpful, giving him a cornucopia brimming with information, and all of it perturbing. The Foul Grove she spoke of could not be a natural place. There must be some sort of anomalous cause. Most likely, some sort of dark magic was performed. He suspected that the tremendous storm she had described that created the graveyard of trees was connected in some manner. Most likely a ritual to consolidate power that used the energy of the storm to complete the spell. One thing was certain: he needed to visit this Foul Grove himself and investigate the area. It would be risky, but it was necessary. He needed first-hand information and a chance to delve deeply into the haunted trees. There was only one problem: he did not know exactly where the location was. Halmela had given a vague idea, but it would be nice to be led exactly where her mother had entered all those years ago. He looked down at Halmela, who was still lost in thought. The morning sun was making her pelt sparkle with gold, and the gray around her muzzle and ears glittered like silver stars. Her brown eyes reflected the puffy white clouds as she continued to stare upward. The raven knew he must ask Halmela to guide him to where the Foul Grove lay. He did not want to ask. The poor chipmunk had already been very helpful, and he did not want to reopen her emotional wounds more than he already had. But he could not see a better option. He listened to the distant birds, their lively songs a welcome treat. The breeze gently rolled through, ruffling his feathers slightly, and it whispered to him. There were no words, but it was quite clear he should trust his heart. It was no accident or coincidence that he had encountered Halmela, the only creature around, who also happened to know of the Foul Grove and of the great storm. The raven nodded slightly and took a breath and opened his mouth to speak. And just then, Halmela's eyes dropped from the rolling clouds and met the raven's. She gazed at him, a look of curiosity spreading across her face. An eyebrow arched as she asked,
"Why are you staring at me?"
The raven paused, caught off guard slightly, his mouth hanging open. He decided to be plain with his words and uttered, "Because I must ask you a difficult question, and I'm not quite sure how to do so." Halmela smiled wryly, understanding instantly what the raven was thinking.
"You'd like me to lead you to the Foul Grove?"
She stated. The raven smiled, chuckling slightly, his affection for the little chipmunk growing, and he replied, "My dear, you are nothing if not astute. Yes, I must go and inspect the place and investigate firsthand. You will not have to get close at all. Simply guide me, roughly, where I need to go, and I shall then bring you back here safely and be on my way." He paused and looked at Halmela, giving her time to respond. The chipmunk frowned slightly, her brow pinching, and she looked at the raven once again, staring into his deep, violet-colored eyes. Then her body language changed. The nervous tension shifted into excitement, and she told the raven,
I will show you, Watcher, for you have done me a kindness by easing my heart, sitting with me as I felt the long chain of thoughts and memories, both bitter and sweet. I have lived so long in fear of my own heart, and you have given me peace, a gift well appreciated.
She paused, trying to phrase her words carefully.
However, I have one request I must ask of you.
The raven raised his eyebrow in turn. "My dear, name your price, and I shall be delighted to honor whatever you ask," he said, and Halmela did not hesitate.
I would like to travel to the lake my mother promised to show me. I can think of nothing that would bring more joy than to lay my eyes on it. The way she talked of it, snow-capped mountains looming in the distance, sparkling in the light of the sun and the stars, and its vast, seemingly endless shores, and a perfect pebble beach scattered with mossy boulders.
She finished, taking a breath as a tear fell from her eyes. But she was smiling a watery smile, and she seemed more wistful than sad, a laugh gently playing on her lips.
So what do you say, Watcher? Do we have a deal?
She asked. "Absolutely, it will be a pleasure. I'd quite like to see this magical place myself, and there is something that tells me it is wise to travel there. I sense that such a place will be full of pleasant surprises," the raven replied.
Very well, we have ourselves a deal.
Halmela stated, and the raven smiled at her and nodded. "I assume there will be preparations you need to make before we set off," he asked.
Yes, there is much I should tend to before we leave. Let's go over to my den. It's just down the way in an old hollow sweet gum, in the gully at the bottom of the hill.
She said, and the two set off through the piles of sticks and twigs between the massive trunks of the fallen trees. In the clear morning sun, the raven could fully appreciate just how massive some of these trees in the graveyard were. Many were wider than several men. Their thick and gnarled trunks looked like small mountains poking out between yellow grass. The leaves of the saplings poking out between were turning into a swath of fiery colors. Saplings of maples, sweet gums, oaks, and elms spotted the landscape along tall, wispy grass with cotton-like puffs that swayed gently in the breeze. The raven felt a gentle tug of melancholy for the loss of what was once surely a magnificent living cathedral. The grandeur of the bones and scraps alone told of how awesomely breathtaking this forest once was. Yet not all was sadness. The forest, despite its trauma, was far from dead. These scrawny scraps would one day reach the clouds like the titans that birthed them. And the bones of their fathers were home to hordes of mushrooms and fuzzy, vibrant emerald moss and creeping lichens, each of which in turn held their own tiny worlds of bugs, mites, gnats, and tiny little spores, much too small to be seen. And of course, every imaginable sprite, elf, and forest spirit. He could sense them moving about their daily chores, moving water and dirt, and tending to their charges like mothers to babes. Life teemed everywhere he looked, and so his sadness melted away slightly. To the back of his mind, as he and Halmela reached the bottom of the hill, and approached the entrance to her den. As she said, the den lay in a hollowed-out sweet gum tree that had rolled down the gully, perhaps washed by the torrential rains from the great storm. The channels were deep, several feet tall, and covered with moss and ferns. Halmela walked up to the bottom of the tree, its old roots creating an elaborate Gothic archway above the tunnel that led to the interior. The raven ducked his head and followed Halmela inside. He was quite impressed by what he saw. Sunlight filtered in delicately through some small holes and cracks in the tree, and the sunbeams dancing playfully, dappling every surface with their warm light. Further down the trunk, near the center, there was a large opening akin to a sunroof, where a branch had broken off long ago, leaving an opening in the crook. Around the perimeter of the walls were tables and shelves, woven out of twigs and lashed with pine straw and pieces of vines. On the shelves were a variety of dried plants, small clay pots and cups. Also among the contents were jars of dried jams and poultices and sachets of herbs and flowers. In the center was a table made of dark and rich wood. Small rugs of moss were scattered about, providing a wonderful surface to walk along. On the other side of the sunroof was a stove made out of rocks and dried mud, a wood-turning lathe, and a loom. Well, I must say, Halmela, that the word den hardly does this place justice. This is quite a lovely home, the raven said to Halmela. She chuckled and replied,
Yes, it is quite lovely. My mother and I moved here after the great storm because the old den was flooded. The credit for many of the nice things goes to her. She taught me how to weave, how to form mud into clay, and how to turn the clay into cups and pots and jars. The stove, the loom, and the wood lathe were all her constructions as well.
The raven nodded and said she was an impressive woman. All of this took quite a lot of dedication and skill. Halmela smiled in agreement. She then continued to a chest in the corner next to a series of cabinets. She pulled a large piece of fabric out and unfolded it. It was a mosaic of dark green colors. The raven leaned a little closer and saw that it was woven from moss and various plant fibers. It was not dissimilar to wool or heavy cotton. Fascinating, the raven thought. What an ingenious idea. He looked around, genuinely impressed at the handiwork of Halmela and her mother. His eyes returned to Halmela, and he watched as she deftly folded the cloth into a large satchel by tying the corners of the cloth, creating a drawstring effect. She then opened one of the cabinets and grabbed several dried berries and fruits and a few jars of various nuts and seeds. She then pulled open a second cabinet and grabbed a large jar of honey. She rummaged a little bit and pulled out a loaf of bread wrapped in a soft linen. The raven was now surely impressed. Curious, he inquired of Halmela, "How do you make the bread?" She replied,
I gather buckthorn nuts, which you can distinguish by the branches of the bush. They look just like deer antlers. I then take them to a kind tree friend of mine, a juniper by the creek, and he has a wobbly branch that I can jump up and down on and crack open the nuts, which I wedge in the crevice of his branch and trunk. Then it's just a matter of grinding the inner bits with 2 flat river stones, and then I bake it into bread.
She finished with a smile, amused by the question. The raven nodded. That made perfect sense and was quite clever. Then another thought struck him. "How do you light the fire?" he asked. Halmela laughed.
Well, that's easy.
She exclaimed.
Come follow me, I'll show you,
She said. So the raven followed her to the wood stove, sitting on a small stone table, and next to it was a heavy piece of cloth. Halmela then grabbed it and theatrically revealed a beautiful piece of quartz, glimmering in the sun, tiny rainbows dancing like dewdrops on its surface. The raven gawked at the jewel, mesmerized by its beauty. Ravens have an aptitude for shiny things, sort of an enthrallment, that makes them excellent treasure hunters. Slowly, with effort, the raven pulled his eyes from the quartz and looked over at Halmela. "Where in the world did you acquire this magnificent treasure?" he exclaimed.
It was a gift,
She said.
It was given to me by one of 2 elder trees nearby. Well, relatively nearby. They live about a 3-day journey from here. While my mother was alive, we were taking care of several oak saplings, and several of them grew dreadfully ill. And so at a loss of what to do, we asked Frella, an ancient willow tree that was severely injured in the great storm, but lived for a few years after, what to do. She told us of 2 father oaks, Selah and Ver, who were still alive. She was told of them by messengers from the Mushroom Kingdom, and knew how we could find them. So we set out and made the trek far to the south, past what is known as Every Man's Pass, a pathway across a shallow point in the Halante River, where somehow over the aeons step-like fissures have been carved out in all manners of shapes and sizes, complemented by moss and vines everywhere, but no brush since it's so rocky, making it so any creature of any stature or ability can safely and easily cross the river. Once on the other side, follow the road for a day, and you will see a triple waterfall, where the Halante, Isord, and Malal rivers merge to form the River Andul. There the father oaks live, towering above the waterfall, keeping a watchful eye. And so we arrived, and brought them offerings of honey and nectar. We had also brought several leaves and pieces of bark from the afflicted trees to help them diagnose their illness. The father trees quickly deduced the illness. A twisted sprite was affecting their circulatory system, and prescribed a remedy of lilyweed and vermilion mixed with juice from an elderberry fruit. They were so impressed by our dedication to travel so far to help their children that they gifted us with this jewel. They instructed us on how to use it, and to keep it covered when not in use, so as to not accidentally set anything ablaze.
Halmela concluded.
Now watch.
She said, grabbing a small dry twig of maple from a stack of kindling by the table. She then strode over to the opening in the sunroof where the sunlight was streaming down. She then held the crystal in the sun, tilting it so one of the many facets was hit by a sunbeam. The whole crystal glowed brightly with yellowish light. At the same time, a small concentrated beam of light came out of the bottom of the crystal like a frozen rope. It met the twig of kindling and instantly set it ablaze. She then pulled both the crystal and the twig out of the sunlight, strode back over to the stove, throwing the match into the belly of the stove.
Fancy a cup of tea before we go?
She asked, smiling at the raven as she threw some dried moss and papery bark in for kindling while she grabbed a stout holly branch and stoked the coals from last night's fire. "A cup of tea sounds delightful," the raven replied.
Do you have a preference for anything, or would you like me to make you my favorite?
Halmela inquired. "Oh, I would quite like to try your favorite," the raven said.
Very well. Let me fetch some water from outside. I'll be right back.
Halmela stated. The raven nodded and said, "I'll stoke the fire for you and get it nice and hot." Halmela smiled and thanked him, then grabbed the kettle and darted toward the entrance. The raven turned to the pile of firewood and grabbed 2 thick bundles with his talons and brought them to the oven. He then neatly stacked them in the stove, taking care not to choke out the small blaze that was already burning brightly. After arranging the wood, he then spoke gently, a singular syllable. "Om." An ancient word of power, while at the same time letting out a soft, warm breath. The breath began to condense and move in a tight circle, causing the air and the den to gently swirl around, creating a small cyclone. The raven beat his wings a couple of times, sending the cyclone spinning towards the fire. It was perfectly placed and caused the flames to roar. the air acting as a bellows and the wood igniting quickly, and within a few moments the stove was extremely hot. The raven smiled, satisfied with his handiwork, and then thanked the wind for its cooperation, and he shut the door to the oven. Just then Halmela returned with the kettle full of water. She walked quickly to the stove and set the kettle upon one of the eyes of the stove. She held her hand over the stove, a look of mild surprise on her face.
You stoke this fire magnificently. It's piping hot.
She exclaimed.
The water should boil in a flat.
And the raven chuckled and said simply, I have a knack for these sort of things.
It would certainly seem so.
Halmela replied. She began rustling through some cabinets near the stove, gathering a bundle of ingredients in her arms, and there was a sachet of dried leaves that had a wonderful earthy smell, similar to the thyme or rosemary, but with a hint of caramel. And there was a mushroom cap, several dried berries, and a small jar of deep purple-colored syrup. Halmela grabbed 2 mugs from a rack behind the loom. One was dark forest green and the other an aquamarine blue.
You prefer green or blue?
She asked the raven, and the raven considered the question, for as an air spirit he certainly had a propensity for all the shades of blue. They reminded him of open skies and summer sun. Yet the green was a lovely shade of dark emerald, just a hint of blue. He deliberated for a moment and said, I'll have the blue one. Halmela smiled and said,
Perfect. The green one is my favorite.
She then set to work, chopping the leaves into small bits along with the mushroom cap. She then divided them evenly into the mugs and added a generous pour of the purple syrup to each. The raven took the opportunity to ask her about the ingredients she had chosen. What are the tea leaves you've added? They've quite a remarkable scent, a smell I am unfamiliar with, yet I quite like it, the raven queried.
Oh, well, it's not surprising you've not smelt them before, for according to my mother, they are unique to the river Halante. You see, they are a variation of mugwort, except this species mutated at one point and started to grow taller with elongated leaves. The thistle-like growths on the ends were no longer white and puffy, they were now a deep lavender and much denser. They also seemed quite fond of the mucky clay and sand along the banks of the river. The old willow tree I mentioned, Frella, she grew quite fond of this new variation. You see, she was rooted near the river, and was, as a result, lacking the comforts of flowers. These new plants flowered heavily throughout the spring and summer, and loved the river, making them ideal company for Frella. And so my mother and I cultivated them, and they grew marvelously. They spread up and down the river as far as we could see. As Frella grew to know the plants, she learned the leaves, when steeped, filled one with vigor and energy. They bolstered against sickness and foul sprites, relieved jinxes and hexes, and provided rare compounds that ease the mind of stress and help your memory. And the thistle-like growths, when brewed and fermented with honey and nectar, taste divine. A perfect mix of aromas, bitter and sweet, that just whiffing the vapor leaves you euphoric.
Halmela finished. As the raven opened his mouth to ask about the mushroom, she quickly added,
The mushroom is called a nogglecap, and I added one because they're supposed to bring good luck.
Then the kettle began to whistle as she turned toward it and began to pour the hot water into the mugs. The raven watched the steam billow out of the mugs. He enjoyed the serpentine pattern they moved in. There was a beautiful expression of order through chaos. The wisp of vapor dancing and twirling in an elaborate and ornate dance, each step calculated and executed with a heavenly grace. He was excited to try this brew, for he was already feeling the effects of just the aroma in the air. He was sure drinking it would be quite a treat.
Give it about 10 minutes to steep, and it shall be ready. I'm going to finish gathering supplies for the journey.
Halmela stated, and the raven nodded and resumed watching the vapor. Halmela buzzed around gathering a few things and tidying up. After the 10 minutes passed, she grabbed the blue mug and passed it to the raven. He gripped it with a talon while she grabbed her mug and held it aloft and proclaimed,
Cheers, Watcher. May our friendship be long and full.
The raven responded in kind, and they both took a long sip from their mugs. He was blown away by the flavors that emanated from the brew. A bite of citrus, followed by the sweetness of the herbs and the honey and the bitterness of the tannins, all balanced in perfect harmony with subtle hints of vanilla and lavender. This is marvelous, Halmela dear. 1,000 praises indeed, the raven exclaimed. He took another sip and gently flapped his wings with pleasure. Halmela laughed at his theatrics, grateful to share her mastery of botanical brews. And she took another sip from her mug, savoring the flavor, noting that for some reason it tasted better than ever. Perhaps because she shared it in the company of a friend for the first time. Her and the raven finished their tea in pleasant silence. As the raven drained the last drop from his mug, she collected it from him and rinsed it and hers out with the leftover hot water. She looked over at the raven and asked,
Shall I pack the mugs and ingredients? It will be a fairly long journey.
And with no hesitation, the raven responded, Why, certainly, we shall have many opportunities to enjoy that brew. Also, I'd advise bringing your gem along. It will have many uses upon the road and is too magnificent of a treasure to leave behind. Or if any wandering eyes were to happen upon it, they would certainly be likely to keep it. Her mother smiled and tucked the mugs and the gem away with the ingredients and tied her makeshift satchel shut and tossed it over her back.
Let us tarry no longer. The sun is high, so we should get moving.
Halmela said, and the raven nodded in agreement and hopped towards the exit. Halmela followed, but she paused on the threshold and turned around. She took one long look at her home. She had known nothing but this life, and while thinking of all the dangers of the road, she almost lost her nerve. Her grief and loneliness swelled up, and her heart thumped. Her stomach felt sour and violent, and was churning like the sea. She took a long, deep breath and closed her eyes. And she waited for several moments, trying to calm herself. Then a voice spoke to her. It was almost her mother's voice, though not exactly. It did not speak words like a normal voice, though she understood what was said better than if words were spoken. The voice told her it was time. She could no longer cling to her past. The safety and comfort she felt here was a false feeling. This raven was much too interesting to not accompany, and he needed her help. Also, she could see that by enticing her to help him, he was helping her. She stilled her will and opened her eyes. She took in her home and smiled. She had loved it, but now it was time to see more of this vast world, and she would be able to return. This was not exile. She turned and walked outside, her heart full of excitement and the thrill of adventure in her step.